All right, how's everyone doing? Good. I'm trying to figure out, did the future of work stay in the room or did they leave the room? Well, who's here is meant to be here. How are you all enjoying VentureBeat, Transform AI? I know it's not happy hour yet, but can I get a little bit more? There we go, there we go. You know you're in the right place when the CEO is still the loudest champion in the room. Let's give it up to the VentureBeat team for just organizing an amazing conversation. So we kicked it off this morning. I felt honored and privileged to be able to stand in an edge technology conference and convening and actually have an authentic, well, at least I thought it was authentic, conversation introducing the concept of DAIS, diversity, equity, and inclusion to the audience. And I'm even more excited because that was an overview, and now we're going to take a little deeper dive and talk with two amazing persons from industry who I'm going to have them introduce themselves in a moment. And if you weren't here this morning, I just wanted to recap. We put forth data talking about our nation's racial wealth gap to set a precedence on the importance of ensuring that everyone, everywhere in our country and beyond has equitable access to the future of work, fourth industrial revolution that's being essentially developed and propelled by edge technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, blockchain, I slid that word in here, et cetera. And so we talked about ways to solve that wealth gap, and we talked about how companies could operationalize diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout their organization. And we talked about doing that through corporate governance, policies and procedures. We talked about human resources strategies. We talked about procurement, supply diversity strategies. We talked about corporate innovation strategies briefly, go-to-market, and then we wrapped up with social impact. Today's conversation will be focused on the corporate innovation spectrum, particularly to the work that these ladies are doing in their respective companies. So, Rumman, Lottie, welcome.
Thank you.
And I'd like each of you to take a minute or two and essentially talk about your path to this stage today.
Sure, I'll go first. My name is Dr. Rumman Chowdhury. I'm the global lead for responsible AI at Accenture. I'm a data scientist and a social scientist by background. So about 2.5 years ago, the field of ethics and AI was very, very nascent, very, very new, and nobody really understood what it was. We only had 1 or 2 books to guide us and a lot of, movies ranging from really terrible to really great. Accenture was very forward thinking and, saying, well, this isn't a job necessarily for a programmer. We need somebody who understands the technology and can build the technology, but actually we need somebody who understands society. So I was probably count on one hand the number of data scientists, social scientists there were in Silicon Valley at that time, and probably still today. So my background educationally, I went to undergrad at MIT. I worked in public policy for a while, did my PhD in political science, but I've always been a quant. So when I think of AI and these technologies, when I think of data, I think of it as quantified patterns of human behavior. So ultimately the purpose is that it's human. And when the data is created by a human or measured by a human, there's all sorts of things that can come into it, all sorts of biases. So when I think of building these technologies, it's fundamentally based on the data, which is fundamentally based on people. So when I think of Accenture and us building artificial intelligence, it's always meant to be with the human at the center, with the human as the focus. So that's my path to where I am.
Cool. Thanks. So my name is Lade. I lead technical strategy for AR/VR software at Facebook. I also run Facebook's Inclusive AI program. The AR/VR team at Facebook is focused on building the next generation of computing platforms. So you think about Oculus VR headsets, Spark AR camera platform, Portal, a home video communication device, and we're also working pretty hard to add AR glasses into the mix. And Inclusive AI is a homegrown operating framework that we built in-house to guide cross-functional teams through the process of developing human-centered AI. So you actually wouldn't know this now, but my path into software is very unconventional. I studied mechanical and systems engineering in college, worked as a mechanical engineer in the motor industry for a few years. Facebook saw the potential for some crossover success, brought me on board as a software TPM in early 2017. And at the time when I joined the Portal team. And early in my time in Portal, I was focused more on like software quality, so creating all of the systems to actually measure software launch readiness of the software. And then after doing that for a year, I moved into just pure feature development. So working with the team that actually ended up building Storytime, which is a really cool interactive AR storytelling experience on Portal. If you haven't checked it out, it's really cool. And then at the time of that switch from software quality into feature development, that was around the time when I had just started to build out the Inclusive AI program. And Boz, who's our VP of AR/VR, he had connected me to a mentor, Ficus Kirkpatrick, who was leading our camera platform team at the time. And when he transitioned into leading all of AR/VR software, he said like, hey, come join my leadership team and lead technical strategy. So that was about 6 months ago, and now I'm here talking to all of you.
Well, if you didn't know it before today, the future is definitely female. I will say that. So let's, before we talk a little bit about the solutions, and we will not figure this all out in 24 minutes to be exact, but, and Lottie, we could continue with you, and then Rumman, let's go deeper into actually talking about, when we talk about a lack of diversity, inclusion, and equity, like truly talk about the problem that's at hand and what has to be solved to ensure equity, in the future.
So when it comes to the technical or the product problem, I like to frame things in terms of risk, right? So when AI meets computer vision and voice, there's representational risk, which is essentially the potential to reinforce marginalization of often underrepresented groups. So you can think of skin tone, you can think of gender, you can think of age, like the list goes on. And then other AI use cases, you have another type of risk, which is more called allocation risk. And like a jobs algorithm, for instance, you'd have that. And that's essentially like the potential to withhold social or economic opportunity. So in either of those cases, the powering AI technology must learn and understand either representational physical attributes, representational risk, or these personally ascribed definitions of self, like race or gender. So in either of these situations, like it's a risk management problem. You have to understand, measure it, and then mitigate it.
So essentially also what you're saying is when you're looking at the problem, if you are colorblind, we're going to have some issues.
Absolutely.
I often say we have to be color brave in terms of actually not just how we approach in terms of engaging people into our respective organizations or into the space or the field, but at the same time, even as we develop the actual technology in terms of its outward use, go-to-market, or expression. Would you also give your perspective on defining the problem that you see as well?
Sure, and there's two ways to think about it. There's the technology, and then there's sort of the field at large. Totally agree. There's a lot of risk involved, and the other part I'd add to it would be the impact. What you have built, what is the impact on the community, on the individuals? How is the design of the system framed? Who are the people interacting with it? How are they interacting with it? Are they safe? Do they feel comfortable? Can they express themselves? And a lot of this can be built into the design. An ethical design, a responsible AI by design starts from the very, very beginning at the concept stage all the way to the very end. And there's so many different intervention points. One of the products, and from a purely technical perspective, that my team has built is something we call the fairness tool, which looks at algorithmic bias and different ways in which bias can manifest itself in the data and in the output of the model that you're building. But then there's the other component, that's the culture and the community of the artificial intelligence community. And that's actually quite critical and important, because if we're going to improve the equity, diversity, and have a more inclusive space in the technology that we build, that has to be represented in the rooms of people that are building the technology. How do we do that? So, and that's a problem that we've been debating for years, and there's so many different intervention points, so many different people, things to think about. But specifically, I like to think about having a company culture that is inclusive to people, that welcomes diversity, and that has to be by design. It doesn't automatically or magically happen. It has to be, like a very thoughtful process that every corporation goes through.
So given your definitions of the problem and literally, sitting here at sort of the epicenter of influence and decision makers in the space, understanding that VentureBeat reaches 40% of the C-suite at major technology companies on the edge globally, and also 80% of the decision makers. If you were grading or auditing the decision makers, and we're going to have an honest conversation. This is a safe space right here. What stays at VentureBeat, what happens at VentureBeat stays at VentureBeat, right? In a safe space. Agreed? So how would you grade the field or the space right now?
You mean how would I grade?
From A to F.
Oh, goodness. That's a hard one to do, right? Because there's so much variance.
Okay.
There are some pockets of really, really amazing folks who are doing a lot of really great work.
Okay.
And yes, there are, plenty of people who still have very bizarre and antiquated notions of what, who should be building AI and what it should mean. So that's actually, I'm going to cop out and say that's a really hard question. That's a very, very hard question to answer. Hard to give an entire industry or an entire region one grade. When you have a lot of folks here who are, we were just talking earlier about
Sure.
AI for All, for example, started by Dr. Fei-Fei Li, and all of those people are in Silicon Valley, and they are really working to improve diversity and inclusion by creating summer programs for 11th grade girls and specifically focusing on underrepresented groups. I would give them an A+,
Sure.
for what they're doing in their efforts. But sure, then you look at things like what are the actual numbers in Silicon Valley in employment, right? Still abysmally low, still has not really moved the needle. And when you look at some of those numbers, you want to give this place an F. And so it's kind of hard, depends on what lens you're looking at.
It sort of reminds me, this was decades ago, but when you were taking the SAT and you really didn't know the answer, they said always choose C.
Always choose C.
All right, so we'll take a C from you on that. Lottie, would you like to add to that? Or?
I'm gonna copy your answer with the C.
Okay, I get it. That's fair. So now let's talk about how you actually are being a part of the solution in your respective organizations. Something exciting that you're working on that you can talk about as it relates to creating more of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive space. Lottie.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, when I first joined Facebook, I joined the Portal team. And Portal is this really great device that really allows you to feel like you're there with the other person on the other side of the screen. And the main feature that allows you to do that is something called Smart Camera. So it dynamically frames you when you're in the field of view. And during a pre-launch test, while I was doing some software quality testing, seated next to my white male coworker, I was the visual point of interest, and it just cropped me out. And that kind of got me thinking, okay, I'm on this product development team, and I don't even have a systemic approach to build this human-centered AI product experience. AI, people have been talking about this a lot today. AI has been around for actually quite some time. I looked around, and I couldn't find anything that defined the problem that I observed and provided a precise solution.
Okay.
So I was like, hey, let me actually build something here. Let me build a framework or a process that people like myself can use on product teams to guide the process from user studies, so when you're creating the initial concepts, all the way to end-to-end system validation. So I just kind of got my feet wet, just started collaborating with different product teams across the company, understanding what their product development processes were, and then updating them in the areas of user studies, algorithm development, and system validation. So when you talk about thoughtfully designing training data sets to have equal representation for critical dimensions like skin tone, measuring model performance within the individual subsegments of the age spectrum, the skin tone spectrum, the gender spectrum, and then also kind of grounding system testing in a diverse range of user scenarios. So once again, just dissecting that product development process into those three areas: user studies, algorithm development, and system validation, and then providing practical guidelines for teams in those specific areas. That's what we ended up doing. And now, most computer vision teams at Facebook are using the inclusive AI process that I started building about a year ago. So you think about human understanding in VR headsets, face recognition in our family of apps, even mobile AR effects, and the list goes on. And a year in, we've actually expanded now into voice AI.
That's quite amazing. It's I guess, just given the acceleration of how technology works when it is in responsible hands, it's amazing how in just a year you've created a precedence or framework that is transforming the internal product development at Facebook, which a lot of times I think when we look, you talked a little bit about just the diversity numbers that are coming out in Silicon Valley in general. Sometimes while you may have pain points on one side, the fact that you have sort of a remnant voice and developer and mind that's in the space, if you think about the implications of how that could go across the Facebook stack, but at the same time, it'd be interesting to see if that framework becomes adopted by like the startup community and high growth companies that are just getting started and are just building, or how could that be translated or integrated into curriculums as they are now rolled out at colleges and universities. Back home in Atlanta, the Atlanta University Center just announced a major data science initiative, and think about a generation of the future being acclimated, to that precedence. Are there any plans to roll it out outside of Facebook that you could talk about?
Yes, so internally we are building out an educational series for inclusive AI just to broaden awareness and improve process integration with the whole framework. And we are starting to build out an inclusive AI team that will be responsible for working not only internally but externally with different partners to raise awareness on this framework, because like I said, there was no precedence for something like this. And we're all about learning from our past mistakes and using that to propel ourselves forward, build the future, and then help others do the same.
Incredible. Rumman, you sit in an interesting position. Facebook hasn't been around 50 years, but your company has been around a while. And so literally bringing that company into the future of work and the clients that you all represent allows you to sit in an interesting space. How are you operationalizing, diversity, equity, and inclusion inside of Accenture and outside as well?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I have a very fascinating role where I don't just work with tech companies. I work with, as you mentioned, some of the Fortune 500 companies. I work with global organizations that are adopting artificial intelligence. And while I know that in the public there's this narrative of, companies are going fast and loose with these technologies, my experience is actually that it's quite different. Most companies are, very concerned about their reputational risk. They're really concerned about their impact. They're concerned about the blowback and the perception of the inequity, et cetera, that can come, bias and discrimination that can come from these technologies. So often, before even adopting AI, they want to talk to somebody like myself to say, how can I build this from the ground up so that it's not, at the very least, not creepy, or it's not discriminatory, or it's not doing something like the unintended consequences. And that's often my job. And there are a few things I look at. The way I think about this space in general of sort of responsible AI, which includes things like inclusion, equity, and diversity, is there's sort of the technical tools you can build. There's a strategy around reputation. How are you presenting this product? How are you communicating to your customers? There's an organizational structure as well. So how is your company structured? Are you structured for success, for creating something that is inclusive, et cetera, getting all the right voices in the room? So then there's this governance component. So with artificial intelligence, it's not just been building the technical products, but it's actually been, how do you govern this technology? And often when we think about creating something that's more inclusive, that welcomes diversity, that actually comes from having a culture, again, going back to the notion of a culture, that welcomes these conversations. Because often in product development or solution development, these can be uncomfortable conversations. And if you're only driven to, deliver at all costs on time, it's hard to be able to raise your hand and say, hey, I think there's a problem with this. So we've actually created a governance guidebook, and it guides you through how to think about artificial intelligence technologies in terms of building principles at your organization, how to set a tone from the top, and actually the thing that I like the most, which is creating a culture of constructive dissent. So how do you create a bottom-up culture where people feel comfortable, dissenting in a very constructive and helpful manner?
I think that's powerful, which leads me to this next question about the concept of maybe regulation and enforcing, audits around the use of processes like AI. There are consortiums like Partnerships for AI that are, coming on the scene. What do you all think about that in the work that you respectively do, Lottie?
Yeah, so I think we're still very early in the process of developing frameworks and systems, with regards to responsible innovation or responsible use of AI. And I think it's very critical, given that we are so early, to have conversations now about audits, process, regulation.
Okay.
And I think there actually are precedents in other industries where risk management frameworks have kind of set the standard of what is acceptable, right? Like you have non-GMO in food manufacturing, you have LEED in construction, you have NIH policy guidelines in clinical research. So it's definitely plausible. I could see it, but it's just so early. So I just think it's a matter of just having the conversations.
Good. Would you like to?
Yeah, thinking globally, we do have some legislation on the table, right? So there's the Algorithmic Accountability Bill, there's the Deepfakes Act, there's the DTOR. There's actually a few pieces of legislation in the U.S. right now. In Canada, we've had them release an algorithmic an algorithmic impact assessment, which is going to be actually required for government services. City of New York has, passed an algorithmic accountability bill, which they have an entire task force tasked with trying to develop what it is. So you're absolutely right, Lade. It's a work in progress, but we're actually seeing regulation happen, and we're also seeing industry making moves. You mentioned groups like Partnership. Accenture is a member, and I'm pretty active with the group, and there's a lot happening at Partnership to think through these problems. And the great thing about the organization is that it's people who represent not just industry, but civic groups, nonprofits, et cetera, all in a room together tackling, and even media, all in this room together tackling these problems. So I'm very hopeful that we are going to be coming out with, whether as industry or as government or even collectively, coming up with some, really great ways to help enable the further development of this technology by creating the right kinds of guardrails so that people can trust the systems that we build.
These are definitely some very, very interesting times, and I believe the decisions that we make, and definitely having not just diverse and inclusive voices as a part of the process, but actually helping to shape this ecosystem are very important. We have a couple minutes left, and I'd like for each of you to talk a little bit about just some very practical steps of how the folks in the room could jumpstart a responsible or diverse, equitable, inclusive initiative. And I believe everyone can start somewhere. My wife and I have been investing heavily in early stage startups and ecosystem building programs for about a decade. And usually when you're able to write a check, people will listen to you, even if it's a small one. And so I think that we are using our agency and our collective influence to influence very, very early stage startups, or even the work we do with like Facebook, Accenture, or VentureBeat, to encourage that there's intentionality around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I'd like to hear from you some very practical steps that the audience could, and those online could take to ensure this.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. I would say first starting out with just defining the problem. I really like that you asked us, like, how do you define the problem? You honestly can't fix what you don't understand. I think that's the first step. Figure out what you're trying to solve. And then two, if you set out to fix everything all at once, like, you won't fix a single thing.
Okay.
With inclusive AI, we actually scoped the first year's worth of work to computer vision use cases only. And then after a year, did we move into vision. So secondly, I would say scope precisely what it is that you want to tackle. And then lastly, just try, and try some more. You can have roundtable after roundtable about this topic without touching the product at all. So don't get like stuck on trying to have this perfect solution, this perfect framework from the get-go. It's really a matter of piloting concepts, iterating, trial and error, and that's what it's going to take to build out these proactive frameworks to build AI more responsibly.
Thank you. Rumman, bring us home.
Of course. So great list. And to that, I would add Make sure the impacted parties are in the room as you're making these decisions. So the example you gave earlier, Lade, about how you're testing the product, and then it wasn't finding you and it was finding your coworker. But if you weren't in that room, they would have never known that that was a problem. So I love those steps you've outlined. They're very precise. And at the same time, who are the people in the room? Who is speaking for everybody else? And that's ultimately that's the burden that we bear when we're trying to make these programs or trying to create these solutions. Our job is to represent all of the people who we are claiming to be including, and that's quite difficult to do. And it's, when you think about it that way, it's kind of frightening. So making sure that it's run by the right people, as I mentioned, the impacted groups and impacted communities is quite critical.
Very good. Let's give Lottie and Rumman a amazing applause. Good. We're going to continue this conversation and take an even deeper dive in Yosemite Sea. So see you at 3:30 for those who want to join us. Thank you.